Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Well, it's a great honor to be here this evening, and let me extend my congratulations to the honorees for the work that you and really everybody here has done on behalf of Beit Orot. You know, it's sometimes said that this is a controversial project because there are people who object to a Jewish presence in East Jerusalem. Of course, I think we know that that's not really the problem. What the problem is for many of these people who find it controversial is a Jewish presence in West Jerusalem. That's what this is about. And in fact, it is the work of Beit Orot I see in a way as legitimizing the Jewish presence throughout Jerusalem and throughout Israel as a whole. How this can be controversial, honestly, is beyond me. But again, I congratulate you on your work. Unfortunately, we're gathered in a time where challenges to Israel's legitimacy and indeed its ultimate existence, I think, have never been greater since 1948. And it comes at a time when, throughout the Middle East as a whole, what minimal structures of political stability existed over these past decades are beginning to crumble. In fact, the influence of the United States across the Middle East and North Africa is at a very low ebb. We can see the consequences of failures of American leadership in country after country, the loss of long-established friendships, the mistrust of America's long-range intentions, and the inability of the United States to project its influence and power, hopefully most typically in peaceful ways, but to have the kind of strength that's necessary not for conflict, but to avoid conflict. The purpose of strength is to deter and dissuade adversaries of the United States and our friends and allies from even thinking about engaging in adversarial behavior. But it is a truism that when the adversaries see weakness, they take advantage of it. And we have seen, unfortunately, in country after country across the Middle East, individual crises, seeing states dissolve, watching the growth of anarchy, increase in terrorism, so that country by country, these crises have begun to meld together into a general and growing sense of chaos. And absent firm American leadership, the prospect is that that chaos will simply continue. We saw it tragically just a little bit over 2 years ago in Benghazi when the American ambassador and 3 other Americans were murdered by terrorists. Murders that we have not yet avenged. And the lesson that the terrorists, their state sponsors, and our adversaries generally derive from this is that if the United States won't protect the personal representative of the President of the United States, who will they protect? Our Arab friends in the region see a declining, inward-looking United States. They see an America that is unwilling to stand up for Israel's legitimate interest, and they say, what will happen to us in our time of testing if the United States won't stand with one of its closest allies in the world? It's not a logic that you would expect, but it's a logic that makes eminently good sense, unfortunately. And now we see Israel and the U.S.-Israel relationship threatened in a variety of ways really across the spectrum. Certainly physically in Israel today, the risk of terrorist attack, despite the precautions that have been taken, the military operations in Gaza, the war against Hezbollah in 2006, remain extremely high. But the threats exist really from the most esoteric level to the most existential level. We see now that the Palestinian Authority engaged in a complex political relationship with Hamas, which should delegitimize what's left of the precious little legitimacy that the authority itself has decided that instead of trying to make peace on the ground in the region with Israel, that it wants to create different sorts of facts on the ground in the structure of international institutions. And ostensibly, this campaign, which we've seen play out in recent days, is about legitimizing a Palestinian state. But the fact is that under the terms that are being discussed, this is not really so much about a Palestinian state being legitimized as it is Israel being delegitimized. Because the approach that's being taken ignores Israel. When the Palestinians go to UN bodies or treaty organizations and say, accept us as a state, they are asking the international community to make a decision about their status that has not yet been agreed to by Israel, or in fact, at least in theory, by the United States. And the ultimate objective here, I think, calls into question the professions that Palestinian leaders have made over the years, that they accept the existence of the State of Israel, that they accept its right to live in security, that they accept the binding commitments that have been made internationally before now, and that they truly renounce terrorism. And when that trust is called into question, it shouldn't be any surprise that there's no progress at the negotiating table. But that doesn't mean that you abandon the process as the Palestinian Authority has in order to try and work your will in the United Nations. This has followed a long history of Palestinian efforts to create a reality out of blue smoke and mirrors. It goes back to 1988 when the Palestinian Liberation Organization was simply an observer organization at the UN. And the first thing they did was to change the name on the card in front of the desk where they sit from PLO to Palestine. Why? Because it sounds more like a state. Now, you have to spend some time in the UN system to understand how anybody can think that this approach to reality is actually going to solve problems rather than create new ones. But that's what the authority has been up to in recent days. And I think we've seen tested the will of the United States to say we have held for decades that the only solution in the Middle East comes when Israel and all of the Arabs that have a stake in the matter have reached agreement that satisfies all the parties. Everything that the Palestinian Authority has done in the past several weeks is a rejection of Israel's legitimate right to have a say in the outcome. And they know that the way they can succeed, or at least why they believe they can succeed, is because they see an inadequate American response. You know, the PLO tried to join agencies of the UN system back in 1989 and 1990. And the response that we took then was to say to the other members of the UN and to the UN system itself, you've basically got a choice here. You want the PLO to become a member? That's fine. You're going to lose the United States money. So when in 1989 the PLO tried to join the World Health Organization, and Fatih Arafat, who was the PLO's Minister of Health, if you can believe that, went to the World Health Organization and made the case for their membership. And our response at the time was to say, if the World Health Organization gives the PLO state status, we will cut off all American funding, even though the WHO does important medical and humanitarian research. We thought it was serious enough to stop this effort that we were prepared to take that risk. And it succeeded, and Congress enacted our threat into law. That's what has stood against this blue smoke and mirrors campaign for over 20 years. And it was only when the United States showed weakness in continuing to adhere to that funding cutoff that the Palestinian Authority took heart. This is a solvable problem if the United States exercises leadership. But it is still a problem reflective of a basic feeling by too many people, and not just in the Middle East, but in Europe and elsewhere, that it's Israel's legitimacy itself that remains in question. I think this is a subject that needs real debate in the United States, real understanding of where Israel's claim and legitimacy to its existence and its right to secure borders after multiple attacks on it in all-out wars and continued terrorist assaults, rocket attacks, and any number of efforts at terrorism over the years have convinced the Israelis that only they can defend their own security. This is something that any other country in the world would acknowledge. It's really only Israel that faces this problem. If the United States loses sight of why Israel is allowed and indeed justified in protecting its own legitimacy, it will be a sad day. I think recent events give us some cause for optimism on this score, but it's a point that can never be forgotten. It may sound tedious and arcane and legalistic, but the essence of legitimacy is something that Israel can never take lightly, nor can any other country. Unfortunately, at the other end of the spectrum, from this attack on Israel's legitimacy under the guise of establishing a Palestinian state, there really is an existential threat, a word that's often used, but when it comes to nuclear weapons, this is as existential as it gets. The Iranian nuclear weapons program, combined with its ballistic missile program, poses a threat really that's worldwide. Iran is not Israel's problem, or at least it shouldn't be. Iran is the world's problem. It is a state sponsor of terrorism itself. It's the central banker and has been for international terrorism since 1979, when the Islamic Revolution took control of the country. And when you combine the threat of terrorism and the potential nuclear capability that Iran is close to achieving, this is something that responsible nations in the world long ago should have appreciated was not something that could be tolerated. It unfortunately has its clearest manifestation as a threat to Israel. But it is a threat whether Iran ever actually uses nuclear weapons. It's not enough to talk about containing Iran, because once Iran gets nuclear weapons, it will spread. Saudi Arabia will get nuclear weapons, probably by buying them from Pakistan, where they're already likely under option in Pakistan's nuclear arsenals. Egypt, Turkey, other states in the region will get nuclear weapons as well. If it were simply a problem of containing Iran, that would only be one existential problem. But the nature of proliferation is that you will get half a dozen nuclear weapon states in the Middle East in a very short period of time if Iran is allowed to cross that threshold. People say, but Iran will never use nuclear weapons. It just wants to have them to feel safe. I'm not sure safe from what, since nobody's threatening Iran except when it engages in terrorist and other aggressive behavior. But it is not true to say that Iran is not a threat so long as it doesn't use its nuclear weapons. Remember that as the biggest funder and aider to terrorism around the world, if Iran had a nuclear weapons capability, it might well have impunity to engage in even more terrorism than it does already. Think back to 9/11. If Taliban and Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan had nuclear weapons then and attacked the United States, would our response have been as clear as it was in overthrowing Taliban and Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan? I don't think so, if the potential existed there for them to use nuclear weapons against us. That impunity that a nuclear weapons state has is obviously something that's motivated the Ayatollahs in Tehran for a long time. Now, we've tried all kinds of efforts to prevent Iran from getting nuclear weapons, through the British and the French and the Germans. We've been negotiating directly and indirectly with Iran since late 2002. We've been at the table with them, in effect, for over a dozen years. And the fact is, the Iranians have been perfectly content to keep those negotiations going. Why? Because time is not a neutral asset. For the proliferator, time is a critical element in overcoming the scientific and technological difficulties that are inherent in the extraordinary complex aspects of nuclear and ballistic missile programs. Time always works on the side of the proliferator, and we've given them well over a decade. We've had testimony earlier this year, early last year, from the Director of National Intelligence, General James Clapper, that the economic sanctions that have been imposed on Iran, while they've had significant economic effect, have not slowed down the nuclear program at all. And that's just the part that we know about. The fact is that we're perilously close to an Iranian nuclear weapon. I have long said, and I've never made any apology about it, that in the absence of a new regime in Tehran, the most likely outcome was that Iran gets nuclear weapons. And that therefore, to prevent that from happening, as unattractive as the choice was, we had to be prepared to act preemptively against the Iranian nuclear weapons program. As Israel, twice in its history, acted against nuclear weapons programs in the hands of hostile states, first against the Osirak reactor in 1981 under Saddam Hussein, and then in September of 2007 against a reactor being built by, of all people, the North Koreans in Syria. The fact is that we're at a very dangerous place. And if the Ayatollahs had believed that there was a credible military threat, it might have been that sanctions were going to work. We've got very little time. I don't know what the government of Israel is going to do. In fact, we don't know what the government of Israel is going to be in another couple of months. We'll have to wait the election. But I believe it is important to talk about the nuclear threat that Iran represents and to make the case right now, before Israel makes a decision, on 2 points. Number one, if Israel were to decide to act in its own interest for a third time against an emerging nuclear state, that the United States be prepared to commit up front to immediately resupply Israel for all lost equipment it needs and to do whatever else is necessary to protect Israel's defense. And number two, going back to this critical point of legitimacy, to argue, whether in the UN Security Council or anywhere else, that an Israeli preemptive strike was a legitimate exercise of Israel's inherent right of self-defense. Now, I hope it doesn't come to that, but I hope even more that it doesn't come to an Iran with nuclear weapons. Because whatever one might have thought about structures of deterrence between the United States and the Soviet Union during the Cold War, that was not a way anybody should want to live. And in any event, the calculus of deterrence against the regime of the mullahs is very different from the calculus of deterrence against the Soviets. This is an issue that has not been as central to the public debate in the United States as it should be. And I think that it is important, as we look ahead now to presidential elections, that we return the issue of national security to the place where it ought to be on our political agenda, right at the center. This is a question in the case of the U.S.-Israel relationship of how the United States sees its role in the world. Are we a force for peace and stability when we defend our own interests, or are we part of the problem? I think the world has never known a superpower as benign as the United States. And I think when we look at Israel, we have to understand it for what it is, part of the West. And that is the key responsibility that has fallen to the United States since the middle of the last century. We didn't ask for it, but in a way we achieved it. We are the leaders of the West. We are responsible for the peace and stability of those who share our values and our interests. We are responsible for protecting them because it protects us. And if the United States doesn't lead, then nobody else will. So I know everybody in this room is committed to the security of the United States, to a strong U.S.-Israel relationship, to protecting all of our allies, including most especially Israel. But it's time we've all got work to do, too. In a democratic country, we have to make our voices heard. We have to make our politicians respond. This is the time to do it. Thank you very much.